Thank you. Thank you, Brad, for having me here, and thank you all for showing up and being here. Okay. So my name is Caitlin Thompson, and this talk is on psychedelics as a novel approach to autoimmune conditions. How many of you in the audience either have an autoimmune condition or know somebody that does? Look around. Yeah. Okay. So, like a lot of people's interest in a topic, it usually has a personal story behind it. And as in my bio stated, I had my own personal struggle with depression and anxiety. And when I was doing my undergraduate, I also got into psychedelics. I was going to raves and festivals and Burning Man and all sorts of things like that. And I was pretty stable through that period because I was using a lot of LSD and mushrooms and cannabis and ayahuasca, DMT, things of that sort. And it was actually really interesting. I was in the tail end of my undergraduate degree, had some hard classes, and I just wanted to take a little break from partying to focus on the home stretch of my school. And so I wasn't engaging in my regularly scheduled LSD experiences. And I found that around the 7th and 8th week mark after my last psychedelic experience, I would consistently start to unravel chemically and get increasingly anxious and irritable and lack of resilience to stress. And nothing had changed in my life circumstantially. And I finally, after 3 or 4 times of this happening, was able to pinpoint that this was occurring the exact same time after my last psychedelic experiences. So then I realized that I really had some sort of physiologically driven depression and anxiety that I had been effectively medicating with psychedelic drugs. I'm like, okay, well that's great, but I kind of want to get down to the root cause and figure out what this is really about. So then I dove into the scientific literature and I kind of just fell down the rabbit hole and accidentally started my own health journey. And later what I discovered was my depression and anxiety was actually related to a bunch of, other issues that I had, like chronic fatigue and joint pain and skin issues and malabsorption issues. And later I was diagnosed with Lyme disease and a number of other bacterial infections and central nervous system infections. And so was born my interest in autoimmune conditions, especially in their relationship with mood disorders. So what is an autoimmune disease? Well, in essence, it's when your body's immune system gets really confused and starts attacking your own healthy tissue, as you can see in this photo that illustrates something along the lines of that. And it's a global health crisis. I mean, you guys saw how many people in the room raised their hands. And chronic illness is the most severe threat to our global economic development, truly. It costs over $100 billion annually to treat people just in the US for autoimmune conditions. It's estimated that 10 to 20% of the global population suffers from an autoimmune condition, and it's more like 30% in the US. And honestly, I think it's higher because these are just people that have been successfully diagnosed and their statistics make it into these studies. And to give you some perspective, there's 50 million Americans that are suffering with some sort of autoimmune condition, while there are about 9 million with cancer and 22 million with heart disease. So the autoimmune epidemic trumps cancer and heart disease even. And the number, the $100 billion that's spent annually, that only takes the 7 most common autoimmune conditions into account without considering the fact that there are actually over 100 autoimmune conditions defined at this point, and they are expressed in different parts of the body, different organ systems, they have different names, and they're treated differently. However, when you really look at it, the etiology or the origin is the same. They have the same driving mechanisms. So some examples of autoimmune conditions are things like fibromyalgia, Crohn's disease, colitis, celiac, multiple sclerosis, eczema, lupus, autism, rheumatoid arthritis, ALS, ankylosing spondylitis, Hashimoto's, type 1 diabetes, and many more. And actually, they're starting to add others to that list because they're starting to see that there is an autoimmune mechanism going on in things like type 2 diabetes and neurodegenerative illnesses. So some of the main characteristics that we see in autoimmunity, I think most importantly is to mention the excessive and rampant inflammation and oxidative stress that are occurring in those people's bodies. We also see a lot of mitochondrial dysfunction, and then somehow this hypervigilant yet also suppressed immune system. It's just not functioning properly at all. You see dysregulated nervous system function, specifically in the glutamatergic system, where you get excitotoxicity, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And, and really you see this manifesting in psychiatric illnesses, mood disorders, anxiety, even schizophrenia and bipolar disorders, and digestive issues, gut problems, which results in malabsorption of nutrients, which causes more problems. And you see food sensitivities and chronic fatigue and skin problems, sensitivity to pain, muscle stiffness and joint pain, and poor brain health and cognitive function, and a susceptibility to infectious organisms. So, what causes autoimmunity? How does this happen? Well, as you can see here, it's quite multifactorial, and people love to blame illnesses on their genes. Have you noticed that? Well, if you can see from this chart, genetics, while they can predispose somebody, they are not the whole picture. And you certainly don't need to be diseased just because you have a gene that means you could have an autoimmune condition. As you can see, environmental triggers are a big part of the equation. And then we have this thing called leaky gut, which I wish I could go into more detail about, but in essence, it's compromised gut permeability. So in essence, we have food particles leaking into the bloodstream where they're not supposed to be, creating a constant immune activation and challenge, which over time will lead the immune system to being quite confused. All right. So, in summary, of the causes that create these autoimmune mechanisms, it's about a chronic stressor. And there are a variety of things that can be a chronic stressor. It can be emotional. It could be a shitty boss, It can be an infection that you have that is putting a chronic stress on your body. It could be an unknown food sensitivity that you have and you don't realize that every day you're eating cheese and you're actually putting a chronic stressor on your body. So, we see a lot of microbiome dysbiosis in people with autoimmune conditions. And when organisms in the gut become overgrown or imbalanced, they can be considered pathogenic or mild chronic infections, which puts chronic stress on the system. And we see that there's also a lot of co-occurrence with these infections such as Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr virus or herpes simplex virus and things of that sort. As I mentioned, there's an emotional component that we see a lot, and it's in the literature, emotional trauma and something called the aversive childhood experiences. And actually, there's some solid research looking at the connection between childhood adversity and the development of autoimmune conditions. In a study that they did in 2015 at Walden University, they found that women with 3 or more aversive childhood experiences had a 60% more likelihood to be hospitalized for an autoimmune condition. And they also found that 65% of women with fibromyalgia reported sexual abuse as a child. So there's definitely something going on there. And while it can sound a little woo-woo to be like, oh, it's all emotional or whatever, there's actually a perfectly explainable mechanism of action where the nervous system gets stuck in this chronic sympathetic stress response, and downstream really messes up modulation of the immune system, of inflammatory pathways, and we actually see prolonged immune changes in people and children that have some sort of childhood trauma. So this is scientifically measurable, and we've done the literature on it, and we see that there is a strong connection between trauma and the development of these immune dysfunctions. Also, exposure to toxins. As I mentioned, a lot of people have food sensitivities that they're completely unaware of. Something like green beans or almonds even, where you think you're being healthy and eating something good for you, and your body just has its own unique immune response to various foods out there. Also, a lot of our food is being doused in pesticides, which act as an antibiotic essentially in our GI tracts. They're destroying our microbiome. We have toxins in our water, in our air, in the soaps that we use, the products that we use. Mold exposure is a huge trigger for autoimmune conditions to develop. Household products and advanced glycation end products, which is a fancy word for eating too much sugar. So I just want to make a quick note about acute versus chronic inflammation. Inflammation is a fundamental process of the human body, and it's very important, and it plays an important role in keeping things healthy. However, when we are inflamed for too long, it actually starts to do more damage than it does good. And so in this case, when I'm talking about, reducing inflammation, I'm specifically referring to chronic inflammation that has overstayed its welcome. So I want to talk about the serotonergic system, also called the 5-HT system. So there are 14 receptor subtypes in the 5-HT system. And what's interesting about the serotonergic system versus some of the other neurotransmitters, usually neurotransmitters are either excitatory or inhibitory. And in serotonin's case, about half of the receptors are excitatory and about half of them are inhibitory. So they really seem to have this very central modulating effect, which I think is one of the reasons why these psychedelics are so good at recalibrating systems. And so, as you guys have probably learned from this weekend already, the 5-HT2A receptor is the mechanism, or at least one of the primary receptor binding sites for a lot of these psychedelic compounds. And it's densely distributed in mammalian lymphoid tissue. And it controls a number of downstream pathways that involve other neurotransmitters and modulating hormones and inflammatory processes in the immune system. It plays a really interesting role in the immune system because it actually seems to be specific to what type of cell tissue that receptor is in. And so it shows this sort of functional heterogeneity and suggests that it has a wide range of immunomodulatory effects, including chemotaxis, leukocyte activation, cell proliferation, cytokine secretion, and even apoptosis or programmed cell death. So I'll just go over real quick the psychedelics' role in the serotonergic system. You've probably heard a lot about this already. So LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, ibogaine, MDMA, ketamine, the DOX series, 2C series, they all have some sort of interaction with the serotonergic system and specifically with the 5-HT2A receptor. And they're generally full or partial agonists, which means they bind in different sort of affinities. You can see just real quickly the similarity between our endogenous neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and how structurally they compare to these psychedelic medicines. So the sigma-1 receptor is something that doesn't get talked about a whole lot in these type of conferences, in my opinion. So primarily DMT is the one that we're seeing bind to the sigma-1 receptor. And it's a really intriguing receptor because it seems to modulate mitochondrial function, which we're learning more and more are actually really crucial piece to neurodegenerative diseases and autoimmune diseases. And the sigma-1 receptor modulates calcium signaling in the mitochondria, and it plays a role in cell survival and apoptosis. And it also modulates these molecules called nuclear factor kappa B and mitogen activating protein kinases, which are transcription factors that ultimately decide which type of pro or anti-inflammatory cytokines are being produced in the body. And sigma-1 dysfunction, again, is implicated in a number of neurodegenerative diseases. So, inflammation, it's a problem in autoimmune conditions. So just a little bit of some research that has come out, and none of it's super recent, so I want to see more happening in this realm. But we've seen that LSD can inhibit a number of pro-inflammatory interleukin cytokine that are secreted from B cells. And we've also seen that DMT can upregulate anti-inflammatory interleukin 10. And DOI reduces tumor necrosis factor alpha in rats, and actually we've seen that it's specifically via activation of the 5-HT2A receptor, because if you give a medication and you block that receptor and it doesn't bind, you don't get the reduction of the TNF alpha, which is really interesting. So I think we're on the right track looking at the 5-HT2A. And then, as I mentioned, the DMT and the sigma-1 receptor activation has been observed to affect transcription factors that really regulate these inflammatory cytokines. And in autoimmunity, there's this sort of vicious feedback loop between inflammation and more autoimmune mechanisms happening. And the more inflammation we have, unfortunately, the process of inflammation creates free radical compounds as byproducts, which create oxidative stress and damage to tissues. And then the immune system tries to help repair the damaged tissue, but it's already kind of wacky, and then there's this perpetual cycle of damage occurring. So I'm going to talk about something called glutamate excitotoxicity, which the talk before me touched on, which is great. So this is something that we see rampant in autoimmune conditions as well. And it's basically an oversensitization of the glutamate receptors in the nervous system. And glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So every time that glutamate binds, it creates an action potential, which is an electrical impulse in the nerve cell. And as a result, a number of free radical species are released as a byproduct. And again, this causes oxidative stress. And when you have oxidative stress, it starts to damage the tissue of the cell. And a lot of our brain is made up of fatty tissue, and fats are the first thing to be susceptible to oxidization. So you see some damage of neural structures such as dendrites and synaptic spines, or even whole cell death when people are having these glutamate excitotoxic things going on. And we also see glutamate excitotoxicity as a driving factor in neurodegenerative diseases as well. So there is some evidence that psychedelics can actually mediate excitotoxicity. Ketamine specifically, which you guys just learned about, blocks the NMDA pathway, glutamate receptor, and has shown to be neuroprotective against glutamate excitotoxicity. It also redirects glutamate to bind to some of the other glutamate receptors, such as the kainate and AMPA, which is normalizing calcium levels and reducing the amount of oxidative damage. Also, the serotonergic system modulates the glutamate system. So by activating these serotonin receptors, there's also some sort of glutamate modulating happening, and it's reducing the likelihood of excitotoxicity developing. And as you can see in this photo, on top you have healthy dendrites and neurons, and on the bottom you have ones that have been inflamed and have started to show some atrophy of neural structures and eventually of whole brain parts. You actually see shrinking in the hippocampus and cortical areas as well when people have a lot of neuroinflammation. So psychedelics have been found to upregulate this neural growth factor called BDNF. It stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And a number of compounds have been found to boost this, such as DMT, psilocybin, ketamine, LSD, ibogaine, and harmine. And basically, it signals the growth and repair of new neurons and neural structures, such as dendrites and synaptic cells. And it ultimately can help you recover from any sort of oxidative damage or inflammation that has compromised the neuron. And we also see it has a role in inducing neuroplasticity so that you can actually rewire traumas and things of that sort. And it's likely a result of this downstream glutamate activation that occurs from the serotonin being activated. So a lot of these chemical bindings, they have more than just direct effects. They create cascades of biochemistry throughout the entire system, which then results in a number of things shifting. So this is especially interesting for any sort of neurological or psychiatric conditions, because you tend to see the sort of atrophy and shrinkage of certain brain regions that are associated with oxidative stress and inflammation. So there's a little bit of evidence that the psychedelics are having some effect on the immune system. So what's interesting is I discovered a study that showed that high doses of LSD inhibited natural killer cells, which is, you're like, why are you telling me this? Aren't you supposed to be telling me it's good for the immune system? What was interesting about it is they found that really low doses that were below 1 micromolar actually increase natural killer cells. So for me, this is a little bit of an implication that maybe there's some immune boosting properties to microdosing LSD. Whereas we've seen with DMT that it actually increases natural killer cells. And harmine, which is an MAOI in the ayahuasca vine, has been found to inhibit the herpes simplex 2 virus and also shows antifungal, antibacterial, and antioxidant properties. And harmine has also been found to boost natural killer cells, specifically against virus and cancers. So I wish I could go into this part more because I think the microbiome is fascinating. But as I mentioned before, a lot of people with autoimmune conditions, they have a number of overgrown bacteria in the gut, which you can consider to be infectious, and they just have overall dysbiosis of that whole ecosystem in the gut. And part of the neurological modulating effects actually influence the environment of the gut via the vagal nerve. So the gut and the brain actually communicate with each other. It's a two-way street, and so they're quite intimately connected. And when you sort of modulate the nervous system, you, as a byproduct, change the environment of the gut, which will ultimately dictate what type of organisms live there, which will, again, influence whether you have a disease or not. And again, I wish I could go more into detail about that, but if you want, you can ask me a question afterwards. And so that's one mechanism that psychedelics could potentially help boost the fight against autoimmunity, but also some of them are showing antimicrobial activity, and chronic infections are a big part of the development of autoimmunity. And I don't know if or when this will ever get some scientific attention, but I would like to know what happens when bacteria come in contact with psychedelics, considering that they utilize some of these really ancient conserved tryptamine molecules or tryptophan type amino acids. So my question is, what happens when you expose gut bacteria to psychedelics? To be determined. So, as a lot of you are probably already familiar, there are some pretty positive and profound emotional effects that can occur from using a psychedelic. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we see this intimate relationship between trauma and the development of these conditions. And by resolving the trauma and sort of bringing it to the surface and unwinding how your physiology has hung onto it and basically adapted so that it can better protect you in a situation that's ultimately not safe. Psychedelics are tremendous for helping people transform that original seed of trauma that's really what's festered into becoming their autoimmune condition. And some of the mushroom research that we've seen, people can have mystical experiences, and there's a number of personality and emotional benefits that result. And there have been some studies, looking at the link between spirituality and psychological well-being. And so it's not surprising that when people feel more connected to spirit or to themselves through psychedelic experiences, that they overall have a healthier emotional well-being, which again is very much related to the physical body. I just want to add one more thing too. In addition to resolving trauma, sometimes you do that trauma work and the nervous system is still in this hypervigilant state of chronic stress response. And a lot of times you also need to retrain the nervous system using a variety of modalities such as meditation or breath work or neurofeedback training or anything of that sort, because you have to physically teach the nervous system to switch out of the stress response, which is easier said than done. So in summary, there's some evidence that there's immune and inflammatory modulating effects from psychedelics, especially via the 5-HT2A receptor and also the sigma-1 receptor. And we see, reduced inflammation and oxidative stress, which are ultimately the drivers of the physical damage in autoimmune conditions. And we see neuroprotective effects and regenerative effects in the nervous system. We see potential microbiome effects with the antimicrobial activity. We see the ability to unwind and address emotional traumas that might be the origin of our illnesses. And we see opportunity to achieve spiritual well-being and a sense of greater connection. So psychedelics show themselves to potentially be quite a multifaceted way of addressing autoimmune conditions. They hit it from a lot of different angles that are crucial in the process of recovering. And I just want to emphasize the importance of a multidisciplinary approach to treating an autoimmune condition. As much as I'm an advocate, obviously, for psychedelics and their implications in treating these type of conditions, they are not going to be the silver bullet. I don't believe anything will be the silver bullet. I think you need about 30 silver bullets to recover from an autoimmune condition. And really, you have to address the root cause. I think the psychedelics, they can mitigate a lot of the damage that's occurring from the immune system being quite confused and dysregulated, but you still have to go deeper and figure out what is it that's causing the inflammation, because the inflammation is just the messenger. You need to get down to the root. Is it emotional trauma? Are you under chronic stress, doing a job that you hate? Are you exposed to mold at your house? Are you actually allergic to, bell peppers or something, and you're eating them every day? So you have to really look at the whole picture and don't assume that the psychedelics are just going to cure it and make it go away, because the psychedelics, while powerful, are no substitution for a healthy lifestyle with adequate nutrition, with mindfulness practice, with healthy relationships, with feeling a sense of purpose and belonging in your life. Or exercise and addressing your trauma. So all those things need to occur, and I think psychedelics can be a part of a really amazing toolkit to address autoimmune conditions, but not on their own. So I just wanted to make sure that I leave you guys with, some inspiration that psychedelics will bring a lot of benefit and relief, but are not that silver bullet that maybe we're all looking for. Skip that. Thank you all so much for your time.